Stefan Gössling, who is in contact with us from Sweden. I know he has to leave us at 3:15 exactly, because he has to swift to another conference, I guess. So please, let's all keep the time as François just did, perfectly well. And now, Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is my presentation coming up? All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. We can go right to the first slide, I think, because the question I've been asked to answer is essentially summarized very well in a quote that was recently presented in The Guardian. So if you go to the next slide, please, everybody might be able to read it. Essentially, this by John Vidal was a good summary, I think, of what we need to discuss. So when scientists say that we must make rapid, unprecedented change to our lifestyles to avoid climate catastrophe, in pinpoint flying as much as the most destructive form of travel, the questions mount. Is there such a thing as a right to fly? And I think that's a good starting point, because we are constantly exposed to different messages. And I've taken one forward in the next slide, where you can see that destinations are often marketed, that airlines often encourage people to fly. And perhaps this is even beyond what people themselves would imagine as necessary. For instance, in this picture, we are told you haven't been to Europe until you have visited these 50 sites. And we also have quotes from, for instance, IATA telling us that the average citizen flew once every 22 months, which obviously creates an understanding that everybody is on the move all the time, that we are flying constantly. And I will discuss this in a minute, whether this is really true or not. But if you give me a chance to present another slide, I have also taken some more pictures here from other advertisements, where, for instance, big sales offer us flight as a very low cost, where we are told that we have priority access, where we are told to book now, because otherwise we are missing out on the great bargains. All of this tells us a story about air transport being sold on the basis of volume and low cost. And this obviously has then repercussions, because in the next slide, from some research that we've done, this is now becoming a bit outdated because it was a study of Facebook users. And if you study perhaps today more in Instagram or other media these discussions, then you will see that there's a lot of content being posted on travel. People, in other words, love to post content on websites that they have about their travel, about their journeys, and this then is turned into social capital. In the next slide, I would like to show that this has also turned from an opportunity into something that people need to do in order to remain part of their networks. Because when, for instance, in this case, Facebook introduced these world maps where people can show where they have been through their check-ins, then obviously it's also clear that you don't want to be the one person who has never been outside Europe. So there's a new necessity coming out of social media that forces people to travel quite often. And in the next slide, you can see that this then prompts people to communicate their travel patterns in very complex ways. They might not only just communicate where they are when they are on holiday, they might already before the trip talk about it, then during the trip, while they are there, of course, but also even retrospectively. So there's a great deal of getting out as much as possible out of these discussions and these trips that we are doing in terms of generating social capital. And people who can't then travel might still engage in imaginative travel or travel philosophy. So we can see that social media has greatly boosted the demand to travel and also connected it to the low-cost carriers in their offers of very cheap flight. In the next slide, then, please, we take a different look at the whole situation. This is how a transport researcher would like to see global travel. As you can see here, it's a slide that shows how much people fly on average per capita in year in given countries in relation to the gross domestic product in these countries. And you can see that in the beginning, with very when money available incomes increase, the propensity to travel will also increase. In essence, this confirms where people have access to money, they will travel more. But there's also a certain relationship here that this is not something that is actually equally distributed. So let's look a little bit more at distributions. In the next slide, I have, from a recent publication, taken a view at how different countries contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and how their greenhouse gas emissions from air travel have increased between 1990 and 2017. And what you can see here is that for many countries, this has increased significantly over time. You can also see that for many countries, it's an issue of domestic air travel. We usually have a tendency to mostly talk about international air travel, also in terms of policies for greenhouse gas emissions. And then thirdly, if you look at the country that's at the top here, the United States, you can see that looking at Annex 1 countries, the United States is consuming more aviation fuel and causing more aviation emissions than the next 10 countries taken together. But if you look into the United States, and that's the next slide, you can interestingly see that in the graph here that just 12% of adults in the United States are responsible for 68% of all the trips that are taken. So this tells us something about the distribution at a national scale, though I can tell you that at a global scale, it's even more skewed in terms of who is flying, because we calculated here that only 4% of the world's population fly internationally in a given year. If you compare that to the earlier quote from Ayata, you can see that this image of everybody flying is not really correct. It's just a tiny minority of the world's population that is flying. And in the next slide, I can show you a little bit about the implications here. You see a world map. This is Paris Hilton's world travel patterns in 2017. Mostly by private aircraft, we can assume. There's another issue here in terms of individuals contributing far more to global climate change through their individual consumption patterns than others. And I think that is probably the most important debate that we have to have in the future, because we have looked at this systemically so far. We've always said, oh, aviation is not important in terms of emissions because it's just 2% of CO2. And what we can see from these new distributions research is that essentially it's very few people that contribute to global emissions. We calculate that just 1% of the world population is responsible for 50% of overall emissions from air transport. So looking at the next slide, you can see that we have a heavy role here for the United States. Within the United States, it's just a very small group, but essentially one country is currently responsible for more than a quarter of global emissions from air transport. And this will change in the future. This is the dark blue bars that you can see that are far higher than the light blue bars. This indicates where people will travel in the future. And obviously, Asia is gaining a key role here. But you can also see that there's some hubs coming up, like in the Middle East, that will play a very important role. So is all of this necessary? This is the essential question I wanted to ask. And in the next slide, we approached this in a study where we asked ourselves, so what are the parameters that we could look at when we talk about needs in comparison to wants? And I think there's two perspectives all the time. One is the individual's perspective, and then there's a social perspective. And then you have two essential dimensions here. One is moral concern, whether we should fly or not, and the other is economic value, or the amount of money we are willing to spend on an activity such as flying. And you can see that we have very different motives here, or different parameters for which we could measure how we can look at these different dimensions. For instance, we have had some debates here, or some talk about flight shame, and that obviously is the social perspective on whether we should fly or not. It's in the moral concern dimension here. And then on the other hand, the economic value might also be measured socially, for instance, in the amount of state aid that is constantly forwarded to the aviation sector in order to have it survive in periods of crisis. So what we can say then, probably quite obviously, is in the next slide, that we have very different reasons for air travel that people would look at very differently. Essentially, I'm repeating a point that was made earlier here. We have a lot of flying that takes place just because it's cheap. For instance, if Ryanair announces that there's another bout of flights that will be sold at a price that is probably lower than the cost of the fuel that is used for this flight, then it will entice people to take these flights, essentially because they are bargains, because you have a personal benefit economically by buying these very cheap flights, because the actual cost is far higher. And this goes on. I think the most funny story that we found here in terms of why people fly is the private flight of a dog that somebody wanted to take from one location to another in a private aircraft. A very wealthy person, obviously, but this was a flight for animals. So what we did then in the next slide is to ask ourselves, how necessary is flight then from the perspective of those people flying? And the easiest thing to get an answer to this is obviously to ask your international students if you have them. So this is what we did. This is an indicative study. It's not representative, but it's quite interesting. The students didn't know what this is about. So in the first question, we asked them, how often did you fly in the past? And that was, for many, not easy to answer, because as you can see, the 29 students did almost 600 flights, and they had to recall all of them. And you see that 40% of these flights were for leisure, 23% were for visiting friends and relatives, 14% for education, 11% for work, and then there's other motives. So it's quite interesting. Also, 1% of all flights were for getting visa. So students essentially had to leave a country in order to renew a visa and then come back. Again, related to the necessity of flight. But the important question here is, are these flights important from the student's point of view? And this is depicted in the next slide, where you can see that a large share of the flights, according to the students themselves, were not important at all, had limited importance, or the students couldn't really decide whether these flights were of all flights. Only 58%, 58% of the flights were considered important or very important. So now the big question is, which flights are important? And this is depicted in the next slide. Here you can see that we look at flight distance by purpose. And you can see that the longest flights are for visiting friends and relatives. Then comes education, which is quite interesting. And then it goes down to work, where we have the shortest flights that were taken. Now, how important are these? And this is almost my last slide already. You can see that the longest flights, unfortunately, are also the more important ones. Please, if we could move ahead with one slide. You can see here that unfortunately, there's one relation here with flight importance in flight numbers, but there's another relationship here between the distance that is covered, and it's quite clear that the longer flights are more important, which perhaps is also intuitive. So to conclude, I think there's something we can learn from all of these studies. I think in the last slide here, I've summarized these conclusions. I think we could do there was a last slide, but I can just tell you what it says. I think it's fair to say that we can do with a lot less flight without stopping anyone, without having or giving anyone the feeling that they cannot do enough flights. Flying is also induced to a significant degree by the low cost of it. And then in terms of climate change, probably prices should reflect the real cost of air travel rather than being subsidized, as is the case right now. In the current crisis, I think it's a good opportunity to rethink where we want to go in the future, because obviously the global model is volume growth at any cost, and it does not consider that essentially we have a case here for reducing overall flight numbers without hurting anyone. Thank you so much.